In a quiet, picture-perfect suburban neighborhood, life was predictable and orderly. The houses were neatly aligned, their lawns trimmed to perfection, and the streets were always spotless. This community prided itself on maintaining its pristine appearance, thanks in large part to the strict rules enforced by the Homeowners Association, HOA. Every resident followed these guidelines religiously. Well, almost everyone. At the end of Maple Lane stood a house that had recently been sold to Jack Thompson, a retired farmer with a lifetime of experience tending to the land. Jack wasn't your typical suburbanite. He brought pieces of his farming life with him when he moved into this cookie-cutter neighborhood. His backyard quickly became home to a small flock of chickens, a modest vegetable garden bursting with fresh produce, and even an old tractor he occasionally tinkered with in his driveway. For Jack, these things weren't just hobbies. They were reminders of decades spent working hard under the sun, raising crops, and caring for animals. But not everyone shared Jack's sentimentality. Karen Wilson, his next-door neighbor, noticed the changes right away. Karen was known throughout the neighborhood as someone who took great pride in enforcing HOA rules. She had earned herself the nickname HOA Karen because of her relentless dedication to ensuring everyone adhered to the community standards. Her own yard was immaculate, perfectly edged flower beds, a sparkling white picket fence, and not a single blade of grass out of place. So when she saw Jack's setup, it didn't take long for her feathers to get ruffled. Every morning, Karen would step outside with her coffee cup in hand, only to be greeted by the sound of a rooster crowing loudly from Jack's backyard. At first, she tried to ignore it, convincing herself it might just be temporary. But then came the sight of Jack's sunflowers growing taller than the fence line, their bright yellow heads swaying gently in the breeze. And let's not forget the chickens pecking around freely, or the occasional clucking noises that drifted over to her side of the property. To Karen, all of this felt like chaos invading her otherwise peaceful world. One afternoon, while watering her prized roses, Karen spotted Jack loading baskets of freshly picked tomatoes and zucchini into his truck. She watched curiously as he drove off, wondering where he could possibly be going with so much food. The thought nagged at her until she decided it must be some sort of business venture, a clear violation of HOA rules against commercial activities within the neighborhood. Karen's irritation grew each day. How dare Jack disrupt the harmony of their carefully curated community? In her mind, his farm-like lifestyle clashed horribly with the polished image she believed every homeowner should uphold. Determined to restore order, Karen began devising a plan. If Jack wouldn't listen to reason, she'd have no choice but to escalate the matter. Little did she know, her actions would set off a chain of events neither she nor anyone else in the neighborhood could have anticipated. Karen's patience had worn thin. After weeks of enduring what she considered an unbearable disruption to her peaceful suburban life, she decided it was time to confront Jack directly. One sunny Saturday morning, armed with a clipboard and a list of HOA rules printed neatly in bold font, Karen marched across her manicured lawn and onto Jack's property. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement, echoing her determination as she approached his front door. Jack was outside when she arrived, crouched near his vegetable garden, carefully inspecting the leaves of his tomato plants for signs of pests. He looked up, surprised to see Karen standing there with her arms crossed and a stern expression etched on her face. "Morning, Karen," he said warmly, brushing dirt off his hands. "What brings you over?" Without returning the greeting, Karen thrust her clipboard toward him. "I need to talk to you about some issues," she began, her tone clipped. She pointed to the chickens clucking happily in their coop. "These animals are a violation of HOA regulations. You're not allowed to keep livestock here." Jack raised an eyebrow, but remained calm. "They're just chickens, Karen. They lay eggs, help control bugs, and don't bother anyone. Besides, they've been part of my life since I was a kid." "Well, this isn't a farm," Karen snapped, tapping her pen against the clipboard for emphasis. "And neither is that." She gestured dramatically at the towering sunflowers swaying gently by the fence. "Those flowers are way too tall, and sticking out into the street. It's unsightly and distracting. Jack chuckled softly, shaking his head. Sunflowers grow tall. It's kind of their thing. And trust me, they're prettier than most of the plastic decorations people put up around here. Karen bristled at his casual dismissal of her concerns. She flipped through the pages on her clipboard, searching for another rule to cite. And what about that old tractor sitting in your driveway? It's rusted and taking up space. This neighborhood has standards, Jack. We can't have eyesores like that ruining our curb appeal. Jack stood up slowly, his weathered hands resting on his hips. His voice stayed calm, but there was a firmness to it now. That tractor's been with me for 30 years. It's got character, something you won't find in those shiny new cars everyone else drives around here. Look, Karen, I understand you're trying to keep things nice, but these things mean something to me. They're reminders of my past, of who I am. Karen wasn't moved. In fact, she grew even more frustrated. To her, Jack's explanations sounded like excuses. Didn't he care about the community? Didn't he realize how much effort went into keeping everything perfect? This isn't about sentimentality, she shot back. It's about following the rules. If you won't take care of this yourself, I'll have no choice but to involve the HOA board. Jack sighed deeply, sensing that reasoning with Karen wasn't going to work. Still, he gave it one last try. You know, sometimes bending the rules a little can bring people together. Maybe instead of focusing so much on what's allowed, we could think about what makes life richer for everyone. Karen scoffed, clearly unimpressed. Richer. These things are messy and chaotic. They don't belong here. With that, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her house, leaving Jack standing alone in his garden. As the days passed, Karen stewed over their conversation. Jack's refusal to comply only fueled her frustration further. She started noticing every little detail: the sound of the rooster crowing early in the morning, the sight of Jack loading baskets of vegetables into his truck, the faint smell of fresh earth after he watered his plants. Each moment felt like a personal affront to the orderliness she cherished. Determined to regain control, Karen began documenting everything. She snapped photos of the chickens, measured the height of the sunflowers, and even jotted down notes about the condition of the tractor. Armed with evidence, she convinced herself she was doing the right thing, not just for herself, but for the entire neighborhood. What she didn't realize, however, was that her actions were setting the stage for a confrontation far bigger than she'd anticipated. Karen's frustration reached its boiling point one humid summer evening. She had spent the day watching Jack from her living room window, her curtains slightly parted as she peered out with growing irritation. That afternoon, she'd seen him loading baskets of fresh produce into the back of his old truck. The sight gnawed at her. Why was he doing this? Was he selling the vegetables? Giving them away? Whatever it was, Karen convinced herself it wasn't allowed. To her, Jack's actions were yet another blatant disregard for the rules that kept their neighborhood pristine. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more suspicious than the last. By the time dusk settled over Maple Lane, Karen had worked herself into a frenzy. She grabbed her phone and dialed the local police department, her fingers trembling slightly as she punched in the numbers. When the dispatcher answered, Karen launched into an impassioned explanation. "There's a man on my street," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "He's acting strangely. He's loading food into his truck like he's running some kind of illegal operation. I think you should come check it out." The dispatcher assured her they would send officers to investigate, though there was a hint of skepticism in their tone. Karen hung up feeling vindicated, certain that justice would finally be served. She stood by her window, arms crossed, waiting for the flashing lights of a police car to pierce the quiet evening. It didn't take long. Within 20 minutes, 2 officers arrived, their patrol car pulling up behind Jack's truck just as he finished securing the last basket. Karen watched eagerly, anticipation bubbling inside her as the officers stepped out and approached him. Jack turned, clearly surprised but not alarmed, and greeted them with a polite smile. "Evening, "Officers," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "What can I do for you?" One of the officers explained they'd received a call about suspicious activity involving his truck. Jack listened patiently, nodding occasionally, before breaking into a soft chuckle. "Ah, I see," he said, gesturing toward the baskets. "These are just vegetables from my garden. I'm taking them to a homeless shelter downtown. Here, let me show you." He opened the back of the truck to reveal crates filled with fresh tomatoes, cucumbers, carrots, and even a few jars of homemade jam. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions softening. One of them asked if he had any documentation proving the food was for charity. Without hesitation, Jack pulled out a letter from the shelter thanking him for his ongoing contributions. "I've been doing this for months now," he explained. "It's not much, but every little bit helps." Satisfied, the officers thanked Jack for his cooperation and told him they'd need to file a report about the false complaint. As they walked back to their car, one of them glanced toward Karen's house, where she stood frozen behind her curtain. Though no words were exchanged, the look in the officer's eyes made it clear they disapproved of her actions. When the patrol car drove away, leaving only the hum of cicadas in the warm night air, Karen felt a wave of shame wash over her. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind. Had she overreacted? Misjudged the situation? But instead of confronting those uncomfortable thoughts, she retreated further behind her defenses, convincing herself that Jack's behavior still warranted scrutiny, even if this particular incident hadn't gone her way. Unbeknownst to Karen, the wheels of karma were already turning. Her impulsive decision to involve the authorities hadn't achieved the result she'd hoped for. Instead, it had inadvertently highlighted Jack's generosity, earning him even more admiration from their neighbors. And as word spread about what had happened, Karen found herself increasingly isolated, her reputation tarnished by whispers of pettiness and misplaced aggression. What she thought would be a victory turned out to be the beginning of something far more complicated and humbling. The next morning, news of Karen's late-night call to the police spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. It started with a casual comment from one of the officers at the local coffee shop, a place where many residents stopped by for their daily caffeine fix. By noon, nearly everyone on Maple Lane knew that Jack had been delivering food to a homeless shelter, and that Karen had accused him of running some sort of illegal operation. The story took on a life of its own, with details embellished here and there, but the core message remained clear. Jack was a kind-hearted man helping those in need, while Karen had overstepped. At first, opinions were divided. Some neighbors sympathized with Karen, understanding her desire to uphold the HOA's strict standards. After all, they'd chosen this neighborhood precisely because it promised neat lawns, quiet streets, and a sense of order. But as more people learned about Jack's charitable efforts and saw photos of his loaded truck shared online by someone who happened to witness the scene, the tide began to turn. Many couldn't help but admire his generosity, especially in contrast to Karen's rigid attitude. Children in the cul-de-sac were among the first to gravitate toward Jack. They loved watching him feed the chickens or explaining how plants grew from tiny seeds into towering sunflowers. One afternoon, a group of kids knocked on his door, asking if they could help collect eggs. Jack welcomed them warmly, handing out small baskets and showing them how to handle the eggs gently. Their laughter echoed through the neighborhood, drawing curious glances from other residents. Soon, parents joined in, chatting with Jack about his farming stories and marveling at the fresh produce he handed out freely. Even adults who hadn't spoken to Jack before found themselves drawn to his warmth and authenticity. On weekends, neighbors would stop by to pick up vegetables for their dinners, often staying longer than intended to chat. Jack never pressured anyone to take anything. He simply offered what he had with a smile. Over time, his home became less of an eyesore and more of a gathering spot, a place where people connected over shared meals and conversations. Karen, however, grew increasingly isolated. She noticed the shift almost immediately. Neighbors who once nodded politely now avoided eye contact when she walked past. At the monthly HOA meeting, Whispers filled the room whenever she brought up complaints about noise or property aesthetics. Even the board members seemed less inclined to support her grievances. Worst of all, she couldn't ignore the growing admiration for Jack. Every basket of tomatoes he distributed felt like another blow to her authority. One evening, as Karen sat on her porch sipping tea, she watched a group of children playing near Jack's garden. They were laughing, chasing each other around the sunflowers, their joy unmistakable. For a moment, envy flickered in her chest, not jealousy of Jack, but of the connection he'd forged with the community. She thought back to her own childhood, spent mostly indoors under her parents' watchful eyes, adhering to rules similar to the ones she now enforced so fervently. Had she ever experienced such carefree happiness? The realization unsettled her. Despite her discomfort, Karen refused to admit fault, at least not openly. Instead, she doubled down on her efforts to maintain control, filing formal complaints with the HOA about Jack's tractor and the height of his flowers. Yet each attempt fell flat. Other residents began speaking up in Jack's defense, pointing out that his contributions enriched the neighborhood rather than detracted from it. Slowly but surely, Karen's influence waned, leaving her feeling powerless and alone. What Karen failed to realize was that her actions had inadvertently united the community in ways she never intended. Jack's presence wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. And as the weeks went by, even those who initially sided with Karen found themselves warming up to the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was room for a little chaos in their otherwise orderly world. One sweltering summer afternoon, disaster struck Karen's meticulously maintained home. It started with a faint dripping sound coming from the basement, a noise she initially dismissed as nothing more than condensation from the humid weather. But by evening, the dripping turned into a steady stream, and soon, water began pooling across her carpeted floor. Panic set in when she discovered the source, a burst pipe hidden behind an old wall panel. Karen scrambled to shut off the main water valve, but the damage was already done. Water seeped into every corner of her basement, ruining her prized storage shelves, stacks of photo albums, and even the antique furniture she painstakingly restored over the years. Her heart sank as she realized the extent of the destruction. To make matters worse, when she contacted her insurance company, they informed her that her claim couldn't be processed immediately due to missing paperwork, a bureaucratic nightmare she hadn't anticipated. Overwhelmed and desperate, Karen found herself facing a dilemma. She had always prided herself on being self-reliant, but this was far beyond anything she could handle alone. The thought of asking for help made her stomach churn, especially after how things had gone with Jack. Still, as the hours ticked by and the water continued to rise, pride gave way to necessity. Reluctantly, Karen grabbed a flashlight and trudged through the growing puddles in her basement, heading toward Jack's house. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down not just by the physical burden of the situation, but also by the weight of her guilt. When she reached his door, she hesitated, rehearsing what she would say. Finally, mustering her courage, she knocked. Jack answered almost immediately, his expression softening when he saw the distress on Karen's face. Without waiting for an explanation, he stepped aside and ushered her inside. "What's wrong?" he asked gently, noticing the dampness clinging to her clothes. "My basement is flooding," Karen blurted out, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do. I need help." For a moment, there was silence. Then Jack nodded firmly. "Let's go take a look." Within minutes, Jack sprang into action. He called a plumber friend who owed him a favor, rallied a group of neighbors, including some of the same kids who loved playing in his garden, and organized a cleanup crew. Buckets were passed hand to hand, mops swept across soggy carpets, and fans were set up to dry out the space. Through it all, Jack remained calm and reassuring, guiding everyone with quiet authority. As Karen watched the chaos unfold, tears welled up in her eyes, not from frustration or anger, but from sheer disbelief. These people, whom she had alienated with her rigid enforcement of rules, were now working tirelessly to save her home. And at the center of it all was Jack, the man she had accused, reported, and tried so hard to push away. By the time the worst of the mess was cleared, night had fallen. Exhausted but grateful, Karen approached Jack, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said, clutching a towel in her hands. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." Jack smiled, his eyes kind. "We're neighbors, Karen. That's what we do for each other." Those simple words hit her like a ton of bricks. For so long, she had viewed her neighbors as extensions of the HOA rulebook, people to monitor and manage. But tonight, she saw them differently, as human beings capable of compassion, generosity, and teamwork. As she stood there, surrounded by the very community she had once tried to control, Karen realized how much she had missed by keeping others at arm's length. Though she didn't say it aloud, the seed of change had been planted. For the first time in years, Karen allowed herself to feel something other than resentment or superiority. Humility washed over her, leaving behind a glimmer of hope and the possibility of redemption. In the weeks that followed the flood, Karen found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The image of her neighbors, people she had dismissed or criticized, working together to save her home, replayed in her mind like a film she couldn't turn off. She thought about Jack's calm demeanor, his willingness to help without hesitation, and the way he seemed to bring out the best in everyone around him. Most of all, she thought about her own behavior, the rules she had clung to so tightly, the complaints she had filed, and the walls she had built between herself and the community. For years, Karen had prided herself on being the perfect neighbor. Her yard was flawless, her house spotless, and her adherence to HOA guidelines unwavering. But now, as she looked at the soggy remains of her basement and the pile of ruined belongings stacked outside, she realized how hollow those achievements felt. All her efforts to maintain control had left her isolated, while Jack's simple acts of kindness had earned him love and respect from nearly everyone. Determined to make amends, Karen decided to take a step she never imagined herself taking: baking cookies. She spent an entire afternoon in her kitchen, carefully measuring ingredients and shaping dough into neat circles. It wasn't just about the cookies, it was about finding a way to say thank you, to bridge the gap she had created. When they were done, golden brown and fragrant, she arranged them on a plate, wrapped it in a clean cloth, and headed next door. Jack was sitting on his porch when she arrived, sipping a glass of iced tea and watching the sun dip below the horizon. He looked up in surprise as Karen approached, holding out the plate with a nervous smile. I wanted to thank you again," she said softly, her voice tinged with vulnerability, "for everything you did. These are for you." Jack's face broke into a wide grin. "Well, aren't you full of surprises?" he teased gently, accepting the gift. "Come on, sit for a minute. Let's enjoy them together." Karen hesitated but eventually sat down beside him, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. They talked for hours that evening, sharing stories about their lives. Jack spoke fondly of his years on the farm, describing sunrises over endless fields and the satisfaction of working with his hands. Karen listened intently, realizing how little she truly knew about him or anyone else in the neighborhood. In turn, she opened up about her own upbringing, revealing the pressure she'd always felt to be perfect and the loneliness that came with it. By the end of the conversation, Karen felt lighter, as though a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally lifted. For the first time, she saw Jack not as a rule breaker, but as someone who understood life in a way she never had. And Jack, for his part, saw glimpses of the person Karen might become if given the chance. Inspired by their talk, Karen began making small changes. She stopped policing the neighborhood and instead started joining in. One Saturday morning, she helped a group of kids plant flowers in Jack's garden. Another day, she volunteered to organize a community potluck, inviting everyone, including Jack, to share a meal. Slowly but surely, her presence became less intimidating and more welcoming. Even the HOA board noticed the shift. At the next meeting, Karen surprised everyone by proposing amendments to some of the stricter rules, suggesting allowances for small gardens and backyard chickens. Though initially met with skepticism, her proposal gained traction after several neighbors voiced their support. By the end of the session, the board agreed to revisit certain regulations, marking a significant victory for both Karen and the community. As autumn settled over Maple Lane, Karen found herself smiling more often. She no longer felt the need to micromanage every detail of her surroundings. Instead, she embraced the beauty of imperfection, the kind Jack had shown her could exist alongside order. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged, not because she enforced rules, but because she had learned to connect. And though she didn't realize it yet, her journey toward redemption was far from over. Sweet Karma still had one final twist in store, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can leave the biggest impact. By the time fall gave way to winter, Karen had transformed in ways no one, least of all herself, could have predicted. Her once immaculate yard now featured a small patch of kale and spinach, tucked neatly beside her flower beds. She'd even convinced her husband to let her keep a few potted herbs on their porch, claiming they added character. But the biggest change wasn't visible from the outside. It was the warmth she brought to the community. Jack noticed the shift too. Gone was the sharp-tongued enforcer who used to march across lawns with a clipboard. In her place stood someone willing to laugh at herself, roll up her sleeves, and pitch in wherever needed. When Jack invited her to join him on his weekly trips to the homeless shelter, Karen didn't hesitate. The first time, she handed out baskets of fresh produce alongside him. She felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known before. It wasn't just about giving food. It was about connection, compassion, and making a difference. The holidays rolled around, blanketing Maple Lane in twinkling lights and festive cheer. This year, however, something felt different. Inspired by Jack's generosity, many residents decided to focus less on decorations and more on acts of kindness. Neighbors pooled resources to host a community dinner for families struggling financially. Children organized a toy drive, filling Jack's truck with gifts for kids in need. Even the HOA board got involved, donating funds to support local charities. Karen played a central role in these efforts, surprising everyone, including herself, with her enthusiasm and creativity. She spearheaded a project to create care packages for elderly neighbors living alone during the season. Each package included homemade cookies, handwritten notes, and practical items like blankets and soup mixes. On delivery day, Karen personally knocked on every door, sharing smiles and stories with people she had barely acknowledged before. One snowy December evening, as the neighborhood gathered for their annual holiday celebration, Jack stood up to speak. Holding a mug of hot cocoa, he addressed the crowd gathered around the community fire pit. "This year has been special," he began, his voice carrying warmth despite the cold air. "We've come together in ways I never imagined possible, and it wouldn't have happened without someone who showed us that change is always possible." He turned toward Karen, raising his mug in a toast. "To Karen, for reminding us that sometimes the best things grow where you least expect them." The crowd erupted into applause, cheering loudly as Karen blushed furiously. For a moment, she was speechless, overwhelmed by the love and acceptance surrounding her. Finally, finding her voice, she simply said, "Thank you, Jack, and thank you all. You've taught me what it really means to be part of a community." As snowflakes drifted down from the sky, covering rooftops and trees in a soft white glow, Karen looked around at the faces of her neighbors. They were smiling, laughing, and embracing each other, not because they followed rules or maintained appearances, but because they cared. In that moment, she understood. Life wasn't about perfection, it was about connection. And so, as the year drew to a close, Sweet Karma delivered its final gift. Karen, once defined by rigidity and judgment, had become a symbol of growth and redemption. Her journey reminded everyone that people can change, and when they do, entire communities can blossom along with them. Under the shimmering holiday lights, surrounded by friends old and new, Karen realized she finally belonged, not because of what she owned or controlled, but because of who she had become.